Today we are interviewing Margaret Stortz, and we're just so grateful to have this opportunity and record you for the Science of Mind Archives and Library Foundation, so we can share your history and wisdom with the Science of Mind community and the world at large. So thank you so much for your patience and your time.
My pleasure.
Yeah. All right, and I'm Kathy Mastriani. I'm Executive Director of the Science of Mind Archives and Library Foundation.
Wonderful.
Again, just a great honor to be here today. All right, so question number one. Could you please tell us about your early life and where and when you were born, the origins of your family, how many siblings you had, and just your religious background?
Okay. I was born across the bay from where I am right now. I am in the East Bay in El Cerrito, California, a little city north of Oakland. I was born in San Francisco some time ago. I'm not going to tell you just what year, but some time ago, and lived my early life there, and then moved across to the East Bay, and I have lived here ever since. I have two siblings, or I had two siblings. My oldest brother is gone now, and my youngest brother who lives in San Jose, California. I had little in the way of religious upbringing as a young person, so I didn't get the imprints that some did as they were growing up. I was always curious from about 11, 12 on up, and so I looked into a number of things. I spent a little time as a Lutheran, and I enjoyed the social life much better than I enjoyed the dogma, which at that point never made any real sense to me. So eventually, as time passed, a friend of mine, as I was a young adult, a friend of mine loaned me a copy of the Science of Mind textbook. And when I read into that, I discovered that everything I had naturally thought about and felt was languaged there in ways that made sense to me. And that was, I want to say, 1965, and I've been a practicing religious scientist ever since.
Oh, that's wonderful. Wow. So what are some of your life experiences that had a significant impact on you prior to coming to Science of Mind?
I can't say that I had any life-altering situations. People came, people went, sad things happened, people lived, people died, and so forth. But I just think that my progression into and in through the Science of Mind was simply natural. I've always felt that as I went to classes and I thought through various things and practiced in the churches and so forth, that my progression was like an electric eye door that opened. Every time I went forward, the electric eye door opened and something else showed up. So it was as natural a progression as it was possible to be.
Wow, nice. That's beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
And you might have addressed this, but how were you introduced to Science of Mind? I think you said your friend. And at what point in your life did you find Science of Mind?
Well, it was at the time that my friend gave me the textbook to read, and I asked her, "You must have a church someplace."
Oh, nice.
And that was the Oakland Church of Religious Science at that time, which was just a few miles from where I live. So it was a very easy matter to make my way up there.
Nice.
And I stayed. I became a student. I became a practitioner. I eventually became its minister. Mm-hmm.
Nice. Who did you study with, and who were your main teachers?
Well, I want to say that my earliest teacher was Dr. Lillian Hopper, who was kind of an iconic minister at that time. And I studied under her, and the assistant ministers at the time. Do I want to say that there was any one minister or practitioner that stood out? No, because they all had something to bring. And the progression was mine to move through, not caused by anybody else, just mine to move through.
Yeah, that makes sense. What relationships have you had with other wise sages within the Science of Mind and New Thought movement?
Oh, I knew and was a good friend of Peggy Bassett, for one thing, and certainly with Marilyn Leo and Dick Leo, and such as that. Those do come to mind. I knew very briefly and inconsequentially Dr. Hornaday, so I knew who he was, and I'd heard heard him speak a good deal. So these people came and went in my life, and they come to mind right now.
Nice.
Particularly Peggy Bassett.
That's wonderful. How were you connected with Peggy Bassett, or how did you know her?
Well, as ministers, and let's see, on some of the committees we would share. She was president of the church, and I was on the board of trustees, so I came to know her more there. And then I visited her church and was part of some of the meetings and the conventions that were down there, and just got to know her more, both professionally and personally.
That's beautiful. How did Science of Mind change your life? And was there one specific event or demonstration that was a turning point for you to commit deeper into this teaching?
Once again, it was just a progression through the electric eye doors. There was no one particular event. It was just, let me say, an expansion of my thought, of my understanding, of my sense of spirituality as I practiced. Just opened and opened and opened continuously more. And my life, let's say my life picked up all the way around, with family, with friends, with the capacity to read, to expand my thoughts, to engage in writing, which I've continued to do for several years, as it turns out, for the magazine and other ways. So that was one of the ways where I did a great deal of work for the Science of Mind philosophy.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. When did you become a practitioner, and then when did you become a minister?
Let me think. I became a practitioner in, I believe, 1971. And then I became a minister in 1981. A licentiate, or the one before that, novitiate, and a licentiate. And then in 1984, I was ordained as a minister.
And where did you serve as a practitioner and a minister?
All through the Oakland Center for Spiritual, what's now the Oakland Center for Spiritual Living.
Right.
And certain things on the level of the organization, I would do certain things for that. I was president of the board of trustees, for one thing. So I served there. And sometimes on special committees. So that's how I got around and got to see more people. And of course at Asilomar, which is in a manner of speaking, a great equalizer. That's where we all come together, so to speak, or at least did, because that in the early days, that was a major meeting place. Now, of course, there are meeting places all over the country, but they were mostly at Asilomar when I was early in Science of Mind.
Oh, it sounds like a powerful connection.
Yes, it was.
What are the highlights of your time as a Science Mind practitioner and minister?
Well, let's say as a minister, I felt like Winston Churchill from time to time, because we had the riots in Watts, California, and then there were the earthquakes and so forth in San Francisco. So we were on hand to serve and to help. I remember that when the big earthquake came, we couldn't get into the church and did not know for a while whether it continued to stand. Oh. We had to meet somewhere else until we were secured and knew that the building was safe, and people would call to see what was going on. So yes, there were times in those disaster type times where I did feel like Winston Churchill, so to speak.
Were there any other highlights that you could think of that?
I enjoyed very much being president of the church and speaking at some of the meetings and bringing forth some of the changes that we had to make and so forth. Some of them were easy, some of them were quite difficult. So yes, I can remember a situation, without going into it, where my main thought was to be able to go home alive. So some of it was not easy. No.
where you really had
Periodically, this church goes through its throes, you might say. We'll be at war with ourselves over one thing or another. There was an element of the racist element that showed up. We had to move through that, and such as that. And so those were not easy to be chair for anything, but we did it.
Thank goodness, good for you. Good for you for your consciousness that you brought to that.
Well, it was my job at the time.
So who are some of your students and your students' students?
Well, there's Eloise Oliver and Muwata Rasuli and Annie Green. These were all students who became ministers. They come to mind now. And from them, Eloise, Reverend Eloise, had the East Bay Church of Religious Science, and there are many who have come from her circumstance as well. The people who followed me in the Oakland Center were not my students. They came newly, so I didn't influence them. But some of the other people I did.
Well, what a blessing. I'm certain your heart and your soul was to each and every one of them.
One hopes. One hopes.
In what ways have you been involved in the larger organizational level of New Thought, such as RSI, UCRS, AGNT, INTA?
Well, let's see. As I told you earlier, I was president of the United Church,
Okay.
and that was in the late. I think that was around 1991, if I'm correct. And I did spend time with the INTA. They gave me a couple of awards. And so I'm looking at one here. It's too far away. I can't read it, but it was in the 2000s, 2009, something like that. I got an award one year and then won another. So I had occasion to be with that group and to speak for them. So that's been my outside connection, you might say. And I've spoken a number of times at Unity churches. When I was no longer in a pulpit, I did a lot of filling in for certain Unity churches, which meant that instead of Holmes' thoughts, I substituted Charles Fillmore.
Oh, there you go.
But the similarities were very great.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
No, it's a beautiful connection for sure.
Yes, it was.
Were you connected with International New Thought Alliance at all, or INTA?
INTA, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I was saying. I had done some things with INTA briefly, but yes, I've gone to some of their meetings, and they attended in part some of ours. So the groups intermingled from time to time, but with enough frequency that we knew each other.
Well, it definitely seems like an important connection with those groups.
It was.
Mm-hmm. What about the new CSL?
I've been out of the realm of leadership or participation in recent years because my husband has needed my care. So that has not allowed me to put forth much in the way of that. And I sometimes keep up and sometimes I don't. So I'm not altogether certain what's new and what's different as Centers for Spiritual Living. What I do know is that our group reinvents itself with some regularity. About every 10 years, we look into that. We get another title. We name ourselves differently. We look into what needs to be changed. We want to relanguage a lot of things without losing the original thrust. My concern is that in this idea of being globally interacting and so forth, sometimes we let go of the terminology that makes science of mind what it is and the references that make the science of mind what it is. So sometimes when I'm listening to people talk, let's say if I went into a Center for Spiritual Living, and that's what its name was, and I went in as a new person, I would likely go in and say, my, that sounds good, I wonder what it is. See, that's what happens if we get away from our roots. And I'm concerned that we could do that. So that's where I find myself today with that which is called the Center for Spiritual Living.
Thank you. Were you part of the integration process, and how?
With for you, CRS and RSI?
Yes.
To some degree. Mm-hmm. I knew the then president of RSI, and I knew some of the interactions that were taking place. I didn't get in on a lot of the really nitty-gritty things that the committees did to integrate the educational institutions, which are different. But I knew that was taking place. So I was kind of on the sidelines around that. I was not in office any longer.
What are your reflections on the merging of RSI and United?
Is something stuck?
No.
There.
Oh, okay.
Ask again.
Okay. What are your reflections on the merging of RSI and United?
That it was a very good idea. Where, of course, doctrinal changes at the top, but this gave two institutions that were fractions and made them a bigger fraction in the world of spirituality. So I think it was a very good idea to rejoin what Ernest Holmes started to begin with.
Thank you. In what ways have you been active in ecumenical, interfaith, and other types of religious organizations? And I think you definitely touched upon that, but.
I actually have not, because let's say I value people's religions and so forth, but I've always considered the science of mind and unity and others more of a spiritual philosophy rather than a religion, because it had guidelines, it had recognizable tenets, but it didn't have the dogma that told you what to do and how to do it. And that has never been of interest to me. So I didn't really interact, except very, very occasionally in situations like that. Sometimes because I get into a situation where there'd be a really involved person in their religion, and they'd want to pound it into you that they were right, and I don't do that. So I didn't get into that.
What are your current spiritual practices?
My current spiritual practices, I do my spiritual mind treatment regularly, and I do a good deal of contemplation, let's put it that way. It's difficult for me right now because of physical tiredness and mental tiredness too, because of what I have to do a whole lot of meditative practices. So I make up for that by taking small periods all throughout the day to contemplate on something that is spiritually important to me, so that I don't lose the connection. And of course, the spiritual mind treatment always draws me in to my shared oneness.
That's beautiful. Absolutely.
It's a way to keep connected when long, quiet periods aren't given.
What impact do you believe religious science and the science of mind have had on the world?
A lot that has to do with the nature of positive thinking, you might say, or the nature of paying attention to your thoughts and trying to think correctly, which is what a lot of organizations, philosophical or otherwise, do as a matter of course. They don't link it necessarily to the science of mind, but they use the techniques. So I see the techniques at work all the time without the adherence to science of mind. I see them working principles, let's say, without knowing what they're doing.
That's a good way to say it.
Mm-hmm.
What do you see as the future of science of mind and New Thought? I
believe that as the species, the thinking human species grows, it will evolve more into a sense of spirituality, which I think is what the science of mind and New Thought holds. A deep sense of spirituality, belonging to life, belonging to God, always moving through the divine flow. I think I see more of that than I do of traditional religious situations, which become less and less valuable in a world that is has greater and greater connections and the link to science. Because I think that the science of mind and metaphysics is much closer to science than traditional religion.
Mm-hmm.
So in its way, whether the organizations expand and grow or not, the practices, the principles of the science of mind and New Thought will expand philosophically anyway.
Yes, I agree. And finally, what words of wisdom would you like to ensure are recorded as the legacy you leave to the world?
Well, I don't know about my sense of legacy. If people want to know what I've done, they can go to the things I have written, either in the Science of Mind magazine or the couple of books that I've written, or there's a blog that I now hold at this present moment.
Oh, nice.
So they can see the nature of how I think and the way I think. But what I would say is that it's always good to remember the principles under which we move, that there is the unity of God in all of life with that this never changes, whether we relanguage it or what we do. The principle stays the same. And the use of let's say, the law of cause and effect stays the same. God may give to all of creation its wholeness, its pristineness, its purity. But what we do with it belongs to what we know and what our beliefs are. And that alters the effects of the law of cause and effect toward us. Because we more or less know what that does. As we think, so do we receive. So if we limit the gifts of the Spirit by our thinking, that's what we're going to get. Let's say, we fashion the way that God seems to come to us by the way we think. So my recommendation to everybody is to think clearly, to let there be clear and open time so that you can receive from the infinite mind, since the mind of God is the mind we use, and to pay attention so that we don't get pulled away by the things of the earth, because that can't help. It never does. Spirituality should be something we enjoy. So if you find your brows knitting when you're doing spiritual work, you're working too hard. So I would say enjoy the practices, enjoy the continuous things that open, because they do. If you continuously do your prayer work and contemplation and meditation, we will continuously open to what God has for us. And that's always a pleasure.
And so it is.
And so it is.
Well, thank you so much for your time and generosity and sharing your life experiences with us. Blessings. I'm so grateful.
Thank you.
For you and everything you have done for our movement and continue to do with all your reigns in Science of Mind magazine that just touch lives, thousands, millions of lives.
Hopefully that would be wonderful.
So thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you so much.
Take care. Hello, my name is Marilyn Leo. I am the founder of the Science of Mind Archives and Library Foundation. I trust that you have enjoyed this interview, which is part of the Wise Sage project of the archives. It is a gift of love, as is the foundation itself, and depends entirely on your generosity. We appreciate your donation in support of the preservation and availability of our science and mind history.